I'm telling you that I'll handle the inheritance on your behalf properly. Be grateful. If you don't like it, let's divorce, haha. Right after returning home from my mother's funeral, Tony said something unbelievable, and I was left speechless. Furthermore, looking at the 2 documents laid out on the desk, I decided to divorce Tony, who seemed to expect an immediate decision from me. Understood. Tony seemed confused by my answer, as he expected me to accept his proposal obediently. Without caring about his reaction, I decided to leave the house, and at my next destination, I decided to execute my plan. I am Hillary Brown, a 30-year-old. My 35-year-old husband, Tony, works at a bank. Since marrying Tony 5 years ago, I have been supporting him as a homemaker. During these 5 years, I have endured unbearable days. Tony works at a regional bank with very poor performance. He doesn't work enthusiastically and feels it's enough to meet his quotas, resulting in his isolation at work. It's pointless to work hard. Just doing the minimum and getting a decent salary is enough, right? I was speechless when I picked up Tony, who was drunk at a work party, boasting to a junior colleague. Although it seemed like he was doing well at work, knowing his work attitude made me want to retort, "You shouldn't be the one talking." Tony has always been careless, looking down on those who work hard. He constantly thinks about how to get through the day with minimal effort. He mocks the idea of effort and has no desire for promotion. He lacks both spirit and passion for his work and is disrespected and scorned by his colleagues and juniors. I often hear him complaining about such things at his company. I work as a freelance painter. Initially, he respected my professional work. However, after learning about my income post-marriage, his attitude significantly changed. Being a painter with that income, how can you even say that? Your skill is hardly different from someone who paints as a hobby, haha. Tony, who had praised my paintings during our dating phase, started bombarding me with negative comments after we got married. Especially on days when something unpleasant happened at his company, his treatment towards me grew increasingly worse. "You're fine alone, right? You can paint anything, and nobody says anything." Meanwhile, I always have to deal with complaints at work. Find a better paying job. Repeated criticism from my husband made me wonder if I should give up my work as a painter. Yet, I continued because of customers who loved and purchased my paintings. Ladies happily told me my husband loved the painting I gave him for his birthday, and couples bought paintings for their children's memories. Supported by customers who like my paintings every month, I managed to continue as a painter despite persistent criticism from Tony. Our living room, mainly my workspace, was bright and comfortable with fresh air coming in when I opened the windows. My mother bought this house for me, a painter, to focus on my paintings. The living room was my favorite place, with a well-equipped environment. Surrounded by fresh air from outside and viewing the scenery from the window often sparked brilliant ideas. However, Tony began frequently entering the living room, which was supposed to be a relaxing space for me. "Hey, I'm working here. I know it's your day off, but I've told you not to come to the living room when I'm working, right? I can't concentrate." Whenever I was painting, he would come to the living room. Even when I hoped he had something important, most of the time, he would just share his work frustrations and sarcasm with me. This situation hindered my work and concentration, so I asked him to go to another room. Then, Tony responded with a mocking expression. "Who are you talking to? I can rest wherever I want. I'm the one supporting you." Tony always threw such threatening words. Regardless of his own work attitude, he took a superior stance because my income was less than his. This attitude started after I opened an account at his request. He learned about my income and savings, and his behavior changed drastically from before our marriage. I thought I could afford a bit more luxury. Hard to believe you're born from a mother who runs a company. Your mother probably didn't think she had such a poor daughter either. Actually, she wanted you to inherit the company, but she must have thought you couldn't handle it and had to pass it to someone else, haha. I couldn't help but hate him because he looked down on me due to my low income and showered me with harsh words. Yet, thanks to his salary, I could still freely continue my painting. Although I think I should inherit the company from my mother, after discussing with her, I decided not to take over the company. There's no need to waste your life for your parents. I'm happier if you do what you want to do. If you're happy, that's enough for me. Your dream is my dream too. Encouraged by my mother's words, I decided to pursue my dream of becoming a painter. However, my feelings and my mother's never reached him, and talking only led to exhausting arguments. I felt it was a waste of time to talk with him, and since then, avoided arguing with him. I just pretended to listen to his words, letting him say what he wanted. I realized during our 5-year marriage that by pretending to half listen to his words, I could live without accumulating frustrations. When Tony realized I was ignoring him, he would click his tongue, discard his words, and leave the living room. Especially since there was no physical violence, I kept telling myself just to ignore him and managed to cope that way. However, a certain event drastically changed the situation. My mother, who was living in a facility, passed away. She was a well-known CEO of a famous car manufacturer, overseeing more than 7,000 employees. During her tenure, the company was top-rated in the U.S., and her name was well recognized in the industry. When I was 28, she resigned as CEO, thinking about the future. It seemed she intended to pass the company to me, but she respected my wish to pursue painting and entrusted the management to her best friend, Susan Hansen. Susan and I have been friends since childhood and lived near each other, almost like family. My mother was well acquainted with Susan. Tony is completely unaware that Susan is my best friend and that she lived nearby. This is because Susan had asked me not to tell Tony about our relationship. I didn't think it necessary to bring up old school stories, but hearing about your recent situation, I felt a bit worried, so I thought I should talk for your sake. Susan began to talk about her concerns for me concerning Tony. In high school, although Tony and Susan attended the same school, they were in different classes and knew each other only by name. Tony was known for his conspicuous misbehavior. I was never in the same class, so it's just what I've heard, but it seems he often clashed with teachers during class. Kids in his class used to say the class could hardly proceed because of him. Susan always visited my house at times when Tony was not around to avoid meeting him. She did attend our wedding, but since her name had changed after getting married, Tony didn't realize she was an acquaintance from high school. Thus, Tony still has no clue that Susan is my best friend. Since Tony shows no interest in my private life, even though I've told him I have close friends, he probably doesn't suspect it's Susan. I don't need you to report everything to me, he said, so I never mentioned Susan further. In high school, I often heard bad rumors about his handling of money. It seemed he frequently borrowed money from friends and hardly ever paid it back, so he only seemed irresponsible with money. That's why I was worried about you. But he said he was working at a bank and seemed to be providing for the living expenses, so I was a bit relieved. However, I don't know what he might say if he finds out I'm the president, so please don't tell him anything about me. Sorry for the weird request. Seeing Susan apologize with a wry smile made me feel sorry as well. The Tony I dated was completely different from the Tony Susan talked about. On the contrary, he appeared serious and like a good young man whom my parents would like. That was my impression when I first met him. I met Tony for the first time at an art exhibition where my works were being displayed. At that time, I was struggling and questioning my work as a painter. During those days, I wondered whether I should quit painting. Tony stood in front of one of my pieces I had created during this period for hours. "Do you like this painting?" Tony did not look at other paintings that many people stopped by but spent hours looking at my work, which most people passed by. Overwhelmed with happiness, I inadvertently spoke to him. "I don't quite understand, but for some reason this painting caught my attention. I was curious because you've been looking at this painting alone for such a long time." Tony is not particularly knowledgeable about art. However, he began to honestly share his current feelings. I didn't realize so much time had passed. I'm not knowledgeable about paintings, but for some reason I wanted to keep looking at this one. The friend I came with has already gone home. I've been thinking about what the artist felt while creating this, and before I knew it, hours had passed. Looking at this painting, I somehow feel a sense of empathy. I've never been interested in art before, but this is the first time I've felt this way, and I'm surprised. As Tony laughed and scratched his head, I was immensely charmed by him. When I heard those words from him, who had no knowledge of art, I felt a slight clearing of the gloom I had been feeling. Knowing someone empathized with my feelings was incredibly joyous. From that feeling, I found myself telling him that this was my work. This was the beginning, and we started exchanging contacts. Although Tony wasn't particularly interested in art, he always came to see my works at exhibitions. "I'd like to see you paint sometime. Where do you paint?" I was delighted that he showed interest in me. With that feeling, I also wanted to know more about him and invited him to my home. Afterward, he asked me out. "I always want to be beside you when you're happily painting." It was the first time someone had confessed to me like this. I happily accepted his confession, and that's how our relationship began. I felt that a lot of happiness awaited us in the future. When I told my parents I had a boyfriend, they were overjoyed and blessed me as if it were their own happiness. My mother happily talked about it to her friends as well. I never thought this day would come for Hillary. She's always been so engrossed in her paintings that I was worried she didn't care about men at all. Really, after I became ill, I was most worried about your future, Hilary. Now, all that's left is to see you in your bridal gown. At that time, my father had been diagnosed with cancer, received a prognosis, and was hospitalized. He endured the painful treatments with the resolve to see me in my bridal gown, and thanks to that, we were able to walk down the aisle together. It was as if he had no regrets left. My father passed away just a few days after our wedding. Afterwards, my mother's health declined, and she was admitted to a facility when I was 31 years old. Though there was no abnormality in her brain, the grief of losing my father was profound, and she never returned to her former powerful self. A little while ago, she passed away happily, saying that my father had finally come to get her. I struggled to accept my mother's death, to the point where I couldn't even paint. However, Tony was in a good mood every day, drinking alcohol. Finally, I can relax. You'll receive all the inheritance, right? It was worth being patient. Now I'm free. Perhaps because he was drunk, Tony said something unbelievable. I couldn't hide my shock and hoped I had misheard him. You're drinking too much. What did you say? He had also been unnecessarily drinking at the funeral, so I sometimes thought it was just a drunk's joke. However, that statement was too significant to ignore. Frowning, I asked him again, and Tony laughed disdainfully. I've always been nice to your parents to get the inheritance. Pretending to be nice was tough. What does their will say? Show it to me? Seeing Tony's insensitive laugh, I felt like I was about to explode with anger. How could he be like this when I was grieving the loss of my parents? Inheritance? The will. I was stunned by his insensitivity and lack of common sense. Stop it. Don't talk about money at a time like this. It's incredibly insensitive. Normally, I rarely get angry at Tony, but I couldn't bear this. Tony had pretended to be kind to my parents solely to get the inheritance, and he never supported me in my grief, only focusing on money, which infuriated me. Hearing Tony's money-centric words reminded me of a story Susan had told me about his high school days. I often heard bad rumors about his dealings with money. I realized that what Susan had told me wasn't just a rumor, but the truth. At the same time, my feelings for him rapidly cooled. What's wrong with you all of a sudden? You've made even the good wine taste bad, he said without addressing his insensitivity, only increasing my anger. I had been telling myself not to mind his terrible sarcasm because I thought he had cared about my parents. If this was all a calculated act to get the inheritance, then even his interest in my paintings and our marriage might have been all an act in. Just then, Tony shocked me even further. The next morning, I went to the living room to find Tony, who usually wakes up later than I do, already awake and waiting. He was completely sober and seemed serious. As I looked at him curiously, he told me to sit on the couch across from him. I did as he instructed, sitting on the couch and watching him closely to see what he would do next. Suddenly, Tony presented me with a divorce paper and something that looked like a pledge, starting an unbelievable conversation. I've sobered up and want to talk properly about the future. Have you checked your mother's will? I hadn't expected him to bring up the inheritance again, just one day after the incident. Had none of my words reached him? I couldn't tell how much of what he said yesterday was serious and how much was a joke. Despite being drunk, it was unforgivable that he looked down on my parents. Even if he blamed it on being drunk, I would never forgive his remarks. I conveyed my boiling anger to him. Don't you remember what I said yesterday? I told you not to talk about money, right? My mother has just passed away, and you don't think it's insensitive. Even if it was the alcohol talking, what do you think of my parents? Keep your voice down. Was it so bad to pretend to like your parents? It had to be done. What do you mean it had to be done? His ridiculous excuses only fueled my anger further. I pressed him about his statements from yesterday, but Tony defiantly asked what was wrong with them. His insincere apology showed no sign of remorse, and the conversation wasn't progressing. Deciding there was no progress, I switched the topic to inheritance. I haven't checked the will yet. There's still so much to do, and I haven't even started sorting through the belongings. Why can you only think about money? Anyway, I need you to check this pledge now, and sign here. What? I checked the content of the pledge on the desk and was shocked. What do you mean? It was a pledge that I would leave all decisions regarding the inheritance to my husband Tony, and would not interfere. Additionally, it stated that if I violated this agreement, it would result in divorce. I was speechless at the shocking content. It's just as the pledge says. I'm telling you, I'll handle the inheritance on your behalf properly. Be grateful. If you don't like it, let's divorce, haha. We're married, so the inheritance you receive is essentially mine to do with as I please. Hearing his words, I felt something snap inside me. Understood. I did not sign the pledge, and keeping my face down, I stood up, headed to my room, and began preparing to leave the house immediately. Where are you going? Aren't you going to sign it? If not, it's divorce. You know, don't ignore me. I know. We're getting a divorce, so I can't live with you anymore. I'm getting ready to leave the house. What are you talking about? Tony likely thought I would sign the pledge without saying anything. His stunned expression almost made me laugh. Do you even realize what you're saying? Are you saying we're getting a divorce? You're joking, right? This is no joke. You're the one who suggested it, right? I'm preparing, so please leave. My anger had been building up for years, and learning Tony's true nature when he was drunk was the last straw. The pledge was the final blow. There was no reason not to divorce after all this. As I quickly packed my bags, Tony tried to stop me in a panic, but I ignored him. He seemed too flustered to grasp the situation calmly. I secretly took the divorce papers, resolved to leave the home I had lived in for the past 5 years. Thank you for everything up until today. Hey, wait! Tony called after me, but I got into the prearranged car and headed to my parents' house. Later, to execute my plan, I decided to visit the bank where Tony worked. You are Mrs. Brown? Tony was on leave to deal with the estate. The sudden appearance of his wife at the bank where he worked understandably caused a stir. I apologize for the sudden visit. I need to speak with the branch manager. Is he available? I met with the branch manager and started with a smile. Hello, Mrs. Brown, it's been a while. What brings you here today? I apologize for coming without notice. Also, I'm no longer Mrs. Brown as we're already divorced. I have something important to discuss with you, the branch manager, so I came. The bank was buzzing with the sudden announcement of the divorce. Ignoring the surrounding surprise, I began to speak. I would like to close my accounts. That includes my high-value and regular savings accounts. I believe this will be my last visit to this branch. What do you mean? The branch manager looked bewildered by the sudden turn of events. Employees listening nearby must have sensed a major issue and contacted Tony. Tony arrived at the bank out of breath, his attire disheveled and hair unkempt. Wait a minute, what are you doing? Tony? Please come this way for now. And Mrs. Oh, sorry, Miss Hellery, this way, please. The sudden declaration of divorce had the branch manager fumbling over how to address me, but he composed himself and led Tony and me to a meeting room. The staff looked on in confusion, and some whispered about Tony's situation. Despite their stares, I ignored Tony and followed the branch manager with dignity. Once in the meeting room, sitting next to Tony, the branch manager began to clarify. About your request earlier to close all your accounts, is there a specific reason? As I mentioned, I've divorced Tony and won't need the services here anymore, so I'd like to close all my accounts. Close the accounts? What are you talking about? Tony's reaction was as I expected. He was uninformed because I had spoken directly to the branch manager about closing the accounts. His flustered demeanor made me sigh, and the branch manager calmly began to explain to Tony, I was suddenly informed that you are divorced, and she wants to close all the accounts she has here. You weren't aware of the account closures or the divorce? I'm hearing about the account closures for the first time. And as for the divorce, we were still in discussions. I had no intention of divorcing. At that moment, I couldn't help but laugh before I could restrain myself, prompted by his cluelessness. Tony glared at me, as if asking what I was laughing at. You might not intend to divorce, but I've already filed the divorce papers. You filed the divorce papers? It seemed he was unaware that I had taken the papers to the office. When he heard that the papers had been filed, he let out a cry, and the branch manager looked at me, baffled by the situation. You were the one who handed them to me, remember? I said I didn't want to sign that pledge, so I took care of it. This was all your suggestion. We are officially divorced, and there's no need for a property division. The house is in my name since my mother bought it for me. I'll give you 3 days to dispose of your belongings and move out. If you can't keep this promise, I'll call the police. But the divorce papers were only meant to get you to sign the pledge. I never intended to go through with the divorce. Why did you take them to the office? Isn't that too much? The pledge? The branch manager didn't stop our exchange but quietly observed. He was probably thinking it'd be wise not to get involved in such a messy situation. However, hearing the word pledge, he couldn't stay silent and asked about it. The manager looked questioningly at Tony, who was unable to explain the pledge. He may not have been sufficient at work, but perhaps he compensated for it by building good relationships with others. By discussing the pledge, Tony might lose his only redeeming quality, and the trust he built at the company could be greatly damaged. In the worst case, he might have to leave the company. Seeing Tony worry about this and choosing not to speak, I decided to confidently explain the situation to the branch manager. My mother passed away recently. He gave me a pledge stating that he would have full control over the inheritance, and that if I couldn't accept that, we would have to divorce. I could not agree to those terms, so we divorced. What did you say? No, that's not true. It was just a drunk joke. I wasn't serious. I wouldn't do such a thing. Tony was desperately making excuses to the branch manager to save face at the company. But it was already too late. Tony was met with cold stares for his behavior that deviated from common sense. Feeling the branch manager's critical gaze, Tony was troubled about how to turn this dire situation around. However, he had no chance against the truth I was telling. I pressed on, challenging Tony further. A joke. You signed the divorce papers as a joke. Did you really think such a joke would work on me? Didn't you reveal yourself that you were pretending to be nice to my parents just to get the inheritance? Are you going to shrug that off as a joke too? I smiled mockingly, revealing truths that undermined his character. Hearing this, the branch manager looked at Tony even more coldly. Tony, unable to say anything, looked bewildered and his face turned pale. He seemed desperate to salvage his pride, but I had no intention of letting him off the hook. I decided to press him further. So, please proceed with closing my regular savings account and the account that has been holding $300 million. $300 million. Tony might have thought that closing just the regular savings account wouldn't be too impactful. But at the mention of $300 million, he was shocked. Where did that kind of money come from? There's no way your paintings alone could bring in that much money. Right. It's not from painting. Painting isn't my only job. What? I've never heard of such a thing before. Watching Tony's bewildered expression, I sighed. Then, I pulled a business card from my bag and handed it to him. This is my real job. Painting is just one of my hobbies. This company. Isn't that the old hag's company? And you're the CEO. Since when did you become the CEO? Tony accidentally referred to my mother disrespectfully and quickly covered his mouth, remembering the branch manager was there. It was too late. The branch manager stared at him sternly. What do you mean? I thought Susan was supposed to be the CEO. What's going on? Susan? Huh? You seemed uninterested in my mother's company, so why do you know Susan is the CEO? You weren't supposed to know Susan and I are best friends, right? Strange, isn't it? Realizing he had slipped up, Tony quickly covered his mouth, his forehead beginning to sweat. I then told him the shocking truth I had learned from Susan. Did you think I didn't know? You were courting Susan for her money, right? Since she's my best friend, of course, I knew. The Susan just contacted me a while ago. I then played a recording Susan had made of a phone call from Tony. The recording captured the day Tony contacted Susan and his attempts to take her to a hotel. Hearing this, even the branch manager was shocked, and Tony turned pale, losing his words. You couldn't imagine that Susan and I are best friends. If you had shown more interest in what I was saying, things might have been different. I knew you were approaching me for money, so I kept my taking over the company and being best friends with Susan a secret. Realizing he had been completely played by me, Tony was speechless and unable to respond. Susan was only placed there as a nominal president. I was actually managing everything. If you had investigated properly, you would have known. But your sloppy work habits backfired on you. I said this with a mocking smile. Then, the branch manager, who had been quietly observing the situation, looked at Tony and spoke. I'm disappointed in you, Tony. I'm shocked that you would treat your wife and her parents in such a way. It makes me question your character. Additionally, losing Ms. Hillary's accounts would be a significant loss for this branch. Branch manager, can you give me some time? I'll definitely try to persuade Hillary. Please, give it a rest. No matter how much you try to persuade me, I'm not going to listen, and I have no intention of stopping the cancellation. When I said this, the branch manager turned to me and then offered a proposal. If Tony is no longer at this branch, would you consider re-evaluating the cancellation? What? Tony was shocked by the branch manager's suggestion, clearly not expecting it. I was surprised by the offer too, so I leaned in, showing interest in what was being discussed. We would prefer to continue managing your accounts if possible. Honestly, I've been at my wit's end with his behavior, so we are considering his dismissal. Including due to this incident, we'd rather prioritize our relationship with our clients over protecting him. What do you think? Branch manager, what are you saying? Dismissal just like that? I'll sue the company. Upon hearing this, the branch manager turned to Tony and began to reveal one bad reputation after another about him. If you want to sue, go ahead. As the branch manager, I've heard from the employees about what you've been up to, and I'll just report that to the company. If necessary, we'll hire lawyers and clear up your misdeeds in court. Realizing that everything was seen through by me and the branch manager, Tony was completely defeated and fell silent. Overwhelmed with regret, he sat down on the ground. How did it come to this? Why me? I was disgusted by Tony's behavior, but I coldly said to him one last time, You've only ever seen others as tools to satisfy your desires. Your own actions have led to this outcome. It's nothing but your own doing. If you have regrets, you should reflect on your character. With that, the curtain fell on my revenge against Tony. Afterward, Tony was fired from the bank and left my house as promised. He begged me to reconsider the divorce until the end. But when I pretended to call the police, he cowered and returned to his parents' home. I had previously explained the situation to Tony's parents, so he was disowned by them as well. Of course, this was not the end of the matter. I had consulted a lawyer about Tony's past behavior and had secretly kept data as evidence. I decided to submit this evidence and, through a lawyer, demand compensation. Considering his repeated attempts to invite Susan to hotels and his sexually harassing behavior, I also decided to seek compensation from him. Tony, who had been after my mother's inheritance, had loose financial habits and had squandered his savings, and now he seems to be living in poverty. He lives in a small, old apartment, working from morning till night to pay off his debts. Meanwhile, I have regained peaceful days, my work is going well, and I am enjoying my time. Hillary, you finally have a smile back on your face. You seem to be enjoying yourself every day. Your paintings are using brighter colors than before. Really. Maybe it's because I have a strong ally like you, Susan Latlee. I've been full of ideas, and my painting is going smoothly. I could even feel that my paintings had improved. One day, a customer who was an antique dealer took a great liking to my work. As a result, orders for my paintings increased, and I eventually held my own exhibition. Thanks to Susan's efforts, the company's sales have been growing steadily, and it has now become a globally recognized top-class car manufacturer. I find time to support Susan's work, and now I continue to protect the company my mother left behind, together with her.